So welcome to the Happy Mindset Podcast. Today's episode is episode number 60, and today's episode title is called Learn Plus Build. So today I'm going to talk about skills development. I'm going to talk about the formula to developing a skill at a quicker pace than you might think is possible for you. So I've learned over time that the key to this is to have both sides of the equation. So you need to have the learning part and you also need to have the building part. What tends to happen from looking at people around me is that most people don't have a good relationship with learning to begin with. From my own experience, I felt that the education system kind of beated the joy of learning out of me, that I lost an interest in learning. I didn't see the benefit in my life. I just associated learning as dry textbooks and measuring up to somebody else's standards. So coming from that mindset, I didn't like learning at all. So it was only off the back of getting into the real world and coming across language hacking that I started to see that learning can be like a puzzle. You can approach it like a puzzle. You can start looking for ways to make progress and start applying it in your real life. So that's the building part. So that's when you start seeing, how does this concept apply to my life and how can I apply it to my life to make it better and experiment with it. So the first part is to, if you're somebody right now who's got a negative relationship with learning, it isn't your fault. It's the way you've been conditioned to think about learning. I would first look at the assumptions you have around learning and bring it in a way that you genuinely can look at learning in a way that you feel excited to do it. Because if you don't have that excitement or that natural buy-in from yourself, it's going to be very hard to sustain it for the long term. And this podcast is about happiness as well, so you won't have a happy life if you're doing something that you hate doing every day, even if it's difficult. The thing is, if something's difficult, you can still enjoy the process and still be happy with it once you know why you're doing it, once you know that you're doing it for yourself and that you can see a purpose to this. The second part of the equation is the building part. So I've just found over time that that learning and building don't necessarily tend to go in a logical sequence. It's not just learning up front and then building. If you look at the education system, there's a lot of learning up front, there's a lot of theory, a lot of concepts. At least that was the way it was when I went to school. And the assumption seems to be that you learn a lot of information and then you go out into the real world and somehow you apply to all that information, even though you don't necessarily know how this applies to a specific thing in the real world. So take an example of foreign languages. The approach that I had in school was to learn lots of grammar, lots of vocab, and then after my first year of university, I went to France for a semester and I couldn't speak a word of French. Even though I'd passed my exams, I'd done quite well in my exams, and I still couldn't speak a word of French. And I was kind of wondering what's the disconnect here. And looking back on it, I realized that going through the education system, about, I'd say, a good 5% of the time was spent actually speaking the language, and it's probably even less than that. I think it was just for oral preparation. We kind of spoke the language a bit. And yet I had this assumption that if I learn French theoretically, I'll be able to go out into the real world and speak it. It doesn't work that way. It's like you learn something, you apply it, you learn something, you apply it. So from language hacking, you started to realize that there's a balance you need to have when it comes to learning a new skill. So with French, I'd learned French, then I got to Spanish and Italian. And with Spanish and Italian, I really wanted to learn. I really wanted to speak to Spanish and Italian people. I wanted to understand the culture. I wanted to make it fun for me. I wanted to become a polyglot. But I didn't want to spend 8 years learning Spanish. I didn't want to spend 8 years learning Italian. If I had to go through that process again, I wouldn't be speaking multiple languages today. So I was like, there has to be another way, and that's how I came across language hacking. So one of the key things in language hacking is this learning and building approach. So the concept you might come across is speak from day one. So the first time I came across that concept, I was wondering, how is that possible? Be realistic. You can't speak from day one. But this is where the psychology part comes in. The only thing stopping you from speaking from day one is your own belief that you can speak from day one, and the uncomfortable emotions that come up from speaking from day one, because it does require you putting yourself out there and making lots of mistakes. But by doing that, you'll get specific mistakes that you can improve on, and you'll also get over yourself more as well. You'll realize that I'm a human being that makes mistakes, but I can learn from those mistakes. That's the important thing, that you learn from the mistakes. So learning this in foreign languages and gave me eyes for it in computer programming. So I think it was 2014 I came across computer programming, and I always had this assumption that computer programming is all about, like, I don't know, scientific people, mathematical people, and that, number one, I wasn't even interested in it because I just didn't know what it was. And number two, I thought that no, I wouldn't be good enough for this because I'm not great at maths. It's not like my strong point. But because I had the experience of language hacking, and because I met William. William was self-learning to code at the time, and he had this belief that you can build real-world projects and follow tutorials online, make things your own, and you can get a real job from that. Up until meeting William, I didn't think that that was possible. I thought that, like, you needed a computer science degree. I thought that was the bare minimum, and that you couldn't get into computer programming otherwise. Since then, I've also seen it occur in my own life. I'm working as a computer programmer today, and what I did was follow online tutorials, build projects, look for the most important concepts, and just build and iterate and learn. So during that time, again, it was the learn-build model. So when I started off with computer programming, I looked for the fundamentals because I realized from language hacking that there's fundamentals to learning a language, that if you start grasping it, if you start getting eyes for it, it can accelerate your learning. So I realized that if it's that way in language learning, then more than likely it's the same way in computer programming. There's fundamental basic concepts that if you start mastering them and start building on them, then you'll accelerate your learning. So, like, looking back on it in the education system in university, it gives you a very thorough, I guess there's a lot of, like, detail and information, which is an argument that it does benefit you. I'm sure there's stuff that it definitely benefits you, but when you get into the real world, you do need to start shifting your mindset. You can't, like, the mindset of continuously gathering information and having a mindset of wanting to be right and fearing being wrong, that will not serve you in the real world at all. You need to get into the mindset of, what do I need to learn right now? How do I apply it? How do I see what works, what doesn't work? And that's going to be your real world feedback. So that's how you're going to start building things in the real world. It's not going to be like right or wrong. It's going to be about learning information, taking it in, applying it, assimilating it, embodying it. So the embodying part is fundamentally important. If you don't have the embodying part, like, you don't really understand what you're saying, it's just a bunch of words and a bunch of concepts that you've memorized, but you haven't internalized. And the power is in internalizing it, because once you internalize it, that's how you perceive the world. Like, it doesn't make sense to you to look at something another way. So the building part as well does require humility, because you'll start realizing that your concepts are flawed, and they'll only get you to a certain level. So any concept that you pick up will get you to a certain level, a certain result, until you realize that, like, you need to start learning new concepts, and you need to start breaking your mental models. So with language hacking, one of the first mental models I had to break was the 80-20 principle. Up until language hacking, I didn't realize that 80% of the input can get you 20% of the output, and if you inverse that, to 20% of the input can get you 80% of the output. So when I came across that concept, I was in a state of disbelief. I was very cynical. I didn't think that was possible. Like, if that was really, really important, my logic was, if that was really, really important, how come I never heard about it in school? So I had to open my mind to the fact that maybe the education system hasn't it all figured out, and maybe they aren't preparing us for the real world. So there were two thoughts that I had to entertain. It's very hard to entertain those thoughts because you spend, how many years I spent in school? I spent maybe 16 or 12 years or whatever it was inside a system, and then you come out the other side and you realize maybe the system was flawed in some way, in a lot of fundamental ways. Like, I'm not saying that the system is irreparable, but I do think in order to thrive in the real world, you need to start looking at things that you always assumed were right, even when it comes to authority as well, authority figures and stuff. Growing up, I believed that authority figures had it figured out, they had it sussed, and that they were right. But they're not always right, and you need to open your mind to the fact that potentially they aren't right. But the key to this is curiosity. Like, if you're coming at it from a place of blaming, like blaming the system, that's where your focus is going to be. So that's not going to help you. That's not going to help the system. What does help is if you question the system with curiosity and you start building stuff outside of the system. That's been my approach. It's been, okay, maybe my education was in some way flawed. Let's start looking at the things where it has been flawed, and let's start building new models in my mind so I can start moving in a new direction in the real world. There's also aspects of the education system that are good. Like, it does give you structure. So like, you've got that structure, and it does give you accountability, and so there's a lot of great things built into the system. But for the real world, as an adult, if you've got that mindset of like associating learning with the education system, then you're pretty much screwed, I think, until you start shifting that. Because what I see in people is this mindset of learning being an obligation, something they have to do, and if they don't have to do it, they'll do everything possible to avoid doing it. Whereas in the real world, learning actually empowers you. Real learning empowers you. I'm not talking about taking in information passively. Again, that would be the model of just learning and forgetting the building part. I'm talking about active learning, where you're actively paying attention to the things that can benefit your life, and you're applying them to test them in the real world. That learning building formula. So over time, like I said, there's no like linear, you learn first, you build first. I've seen that it's like it's a mix. It's like starting off, for example, with computer programming, I knew nothing, so I had to spend a bit of time learning and trying to grasp the fundamentals. I wasn't building any websites or anything like that. After a few months, I think it was about 3 months, I started building my first Flask website. And while I was learning computer programming, I was also in the coaching world. I was just curious about the mind, and I was curious about my own kind of personal problems I was facing in my life and overcoming them and getting new perspectives and new insights. So I did them in tandem. So I was learning computer programming at the same time I was learning about the coaching world. So that prolonged the period, but it's like real world learning. It's kind of random. You're learning things as you go, and you start combining things in as you go along. Like, you're not going to meet a lot of people who are learning computer programming and coaching at the same time. It just happened to be that I did that because I was following my curiosity. That's the only reason. It wasn't that I was looking around me and saying I need to be a coach and a computer programmer. That wouldn't make much sense. I was just going with the intuition and the curiosity and the faith that these things will come together down the line. And I feel like they are starting to come together, because when it comes to learning skills development, I can see the psychology of it much more clearly now, because I've got the language and understanding, because I've been interested in that field. And so like with skills development, one of the key things I see blocking people who already are okay with the learning stage is that they enjoy reading, they enjoy learning. But what's stopping with the building stage is this fear of being wrong. And that's something as well that I've faced, and to certain degrees I continuously face it. But that fear of being wrong, getting things wrong, stops them from ever entertaining building something. Same thing with foreign languages. It's like people who might know a lot of like French or a different language, but when it comes to speaking, they're useless because they've never put much practice in, and they're afraid of getting things wrong, or they're very uptight around people. So I found that from learning French that like I had to start getting over that. It's like, stop taking things so personally. Because you will meet people who will be rude to you, but I would argue it's a minority. It's like 95% of people are nice to you, that they'll be obliging to you, and maybe 5% will be rude to you. But the brain has that bias in the brain that it'll focus on the negative. So if you 9 positives, it'll focus on that 1 negative. But once you're aware of that, you can start shifting that focus to the 9 people who are positive. If there is something you need to learn from the negative person, learn it. If there's not, move on. Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. You'll know yourself. Intuition, feeling will tell you whether there's something to learn here or not. So that's the learning and the building part. Again, with this podcast as well, it's like when I started off trying to talk things out, it was like very slow and gradually getting a bit quicker as I formalize things a bit better, as I get more comfortable speaking. Again, that skills development, it's like putting yourself out there, being willing to not have it perfect and to improve over time. It's the growth mindset. And over time you'll get better. Over time things will make more sense to you, and over time you'll have more logic in your head, and you'll have more open mind to being wrong, which is a very important thing to cultivate. So I hope this podcast has been helpful. That's how human psychology and skills development interact with each other. That's how I see it anyway, and that's how I've learned it in computer programming and in foreign languages so far. That's what I've seen play out. So I hope you got some insights into this, and it gives you a bit more clarity around what you need to do to learn a new skill in a new way, and to as well to shift your relationship with learning. If you feel like it's holding you back right now, it doesn't need to, because it's not a fixed reality. It just requires shifting your mindset, changing things around, getting clear on the assumptions you might be making about learning right now that are holding you back, and then once you start seeing them, you can start moving forward as well. So so I hope today's podcast was beneficial. Thanks again for listening, and until the next time, have fun and enjoy the process.